welcome. So last week, we were talking about the death of Sarah, the land deal that Abraham made to get the cave, and we met Rebecca. That was basically last week. So this week, we're actually going to look at the text a little bit out of order. I just think that would be easier for us. So we're going to finish out the life of Abraham. That won't take long. And then we're going to jump to the only solo story about Isaac. And then we're going to do Jacob and Esau. We should be able to cover a good amount of them. Because the two stories that you probably know them best for happen on either side of the situation with Isaac. And I think we just want to move from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and Esau. So we'll look at it slightly out of order, but it will possibly make more sense doing it that way for our purposes tonight. But why don't we open up in prayer and we can jump in. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the people who are able to make it out. I just pray you'd be with us during this time. Help us see what you have for us in your word. Help us understand the truth of it and whatever it is we need for now or later, whether it's just about who you are. We thank you for this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so I'm basically just we're going to be in Genesis 25. I'm going to read Genesis 25, 1 through 11. I don't have any notes on it. It's very simple. If you have any thoughts, you're welcome to bring them up. But I don't think we need much comment on it, and I'm going to do the same thing with verses 17 through 18. And this just kind of rounds out Abraham. It's a little clunky of a way to do it. This was what we were supposed to do last week. It would have made more sense last week. Okay. Genesis 25, verse 1. So this is after Isaac and Rebekah get married. Chapter 25. Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bare him Zimran and Jokshan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. And Joksan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Asherim and Letershim and Leumim. And the sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher, Hanok, and Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac. But unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 160 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man, full of years, and he was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth. There was Abraham buried with Sarah his wife. I guess we only need verses 1 through 10. So you might actually have a few questions on that, but pretty straightforward. But yeah, what are your thoughts and questions there? Apparently. Yeah, that kind of just sneaks up on you. Yeah, so it is interesting that, you know what, I didn't check his age, but he's obviously he's older than Sarah, and at some point he had another wife after she died, and apparently has a few concubines. They're not really mentioned before or after. Apparently we get a handful of descendants. You always think of just Isaac and Ishmael. I'm sure if we did like a deep study, I don't know if we could find what these other descendants went on to do or settle, or I'm not sure. I didn't dig too deeply into that. But yeah, it's interesting that he still has a few children, and now that after Ishmael, I guess he has the routine down. He just kind of plans on, at the very least, they're not going to inherit the promised land, so he sends them outside the promised land. And yeah, I do think it's an interesting detail that when he passes away, Isaac and Ishmael both bury him in that cave that we discussed last week. And then just verses 17 through 18. And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he gave up the ghost and died and was gathered unto his people. And they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria, and he died in the presence of all his brethren. If you have comments, that's fine. That's even more straightforward. Just kind of rounding off the family line. Okay, so the way the text ends up structuring itself, these, if you consider last week and that, which was supposed to be last week, after Abraham passed his test of faith with the sacrifice of Isaac, so that was 2 weeks ago, last week we saw him securing a piece of land in the promised land. We see him securing a future for Isaac. And then we see the death of Sarah, Abraham, and Ishmael as we follow the line of Isaac forward. So just kind of the way it's presented, you kind of do away with all the other people that you've met so far as you follow Isaac and his line forward. I wrote, Abraham dies in faith, not in sight. He has been given reasons to trust God and trusts him as God does amazing things in his life, even though the promise is not all it will one day be. He plants a tree under whose shade he knows he will never sit. Would have been a much better ending to last week's lesson as to really round off Abraham, but time eludes us once again. Okay, so we're going to jump to Genesis 26, because for the rest of Genesis 25, that's where you get the birth of Jacob and Esau, but we'll take them as a unit. Genesis 26 it's really the thing where Isaac is the main focus of the story. You know, he's usually kind of a background character, if we can put it that way. So it's going to be an interesting text, but we're just going to read Genesis 26, 1 through 17, and we'll get some thoughts. Genesis 26. And there was a famine in the land, beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him, and said, Go not down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed will I give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because that Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge and my commandments, my statutes and my laws. And Isaac dwelt in Gerar. And the men of the place asked him of his wife, and he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say, She is my wife. Lest, said he, the men of this place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. And it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out a window, and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac, and said, Behold, of a surety she is thy wife. And how saidst thou, She is my sister? And Isaac said unto him, Because I said, lest I die for her. And Abimelech said, What is this that thou hast done unto us? One of the people might have lightly lain with thy wife, and thou shouldest have brought guilt upon us. And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He that toucheth this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Then Isaac sowed in that land, and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man waxed great, and went forth and grew until he became very great. For he had possession of flocks and possession of herds and great store of servants, and the Philistines envied him. For all the wells which his father's servants had digged in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. And Abimelech said unto Isaac, Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we. And Isaac departed thence and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. Okay, what do you notice? Maybe this reminds you of something or a story you heard before? Yeah. Yeah, how did this happen again? Mm-hmm. It was bad enough that Abraham did it twice, right? And now we're getting a third replay of this. It's like the same episode's just on rerun, you know? So yeah, how did this happen again? What do you think? I would say so. Lack of faith for sure. And I think we'll talk about it. I think with Isaac, we get a much more explicit reason that we can call it lack of faith. We kind of assume that with Abraham, given the main course of his journey and like his faith being his big thing that he's doing in life, like that's the point of his journey for us. I think it's even clearer with Isaac when we look at some of the verses. So probably not. It's the same place. It's this Philistine territory. I saw commentaries guessing essentially two different things. I mean, I guess it theoretically could be the same Abimelech if you go with the long time, lifespans. But most people either assume that it's a son because it's a king, so same name, or that while we have it in our Bible as like a proper name, that it could be a Philistine word that basically meant like the king. They don't seem to have good evidence either way, but yeah, it's probably not the same guy. Okay, so verses 1 and 2, we just see it's another famine, and it's interesting. I think because the story is so similar, Moses goes out of his way to say there was a famine, a different famine from the famine under Abraham, and he points that out. So it's another famine, and in those verses we have God appearing somehow. Again, nothing given there on what that apparition looked like. I would say apparently the pact between Abraham and the Philistines is still in some effect, because Isaac has no problem peaceably going to that area. But it's interesting. God tells him in verse 2, Go not down into Egypt. Dwell in the land I will tell you of. Why not go to Egypt? That's a good reason. God said not to, so don't do it. Why do you think God didn't want him in Egypt? Yeah, they have been keeping Isaac away from all that kind of stuff. Like they didn't want him to go back. They didn't want him to take a wife of one of the Canaanites. They didn't want him to go back to where Abraham came from. And like we said last week, he never leaves the promised land. Isaac lives and dies in the promised land, never steps foot outside it. The Philistine territory was promised to Israel, even though they didn't take it until, I think, the time of David. Yeah, he's a pretty good pagan as far as it goes, Same with his, I guess, father Abimelech, So verse 3 is where it's interesting. What we kind of have to speculate in the story of Abraham that's similar to this is much more explicit, because here God tells him, there's a famine in the land, and God tells him, don't leave the land. Like, don't go to Egypt. Stay in the land. And in verse 3, he says that, sojourn in this land, I will be with thee, I will bless thee, and kind of more of the Abrahamic promise going forward. But he tells him specifically, stay in the promised land, I will bless you, and I will be with you. And yet, he lies about his wife again. Well, again, from our perspective. So it's what we assume in the story of Abraham is made explicit in the story of Isaac as a lack of faith. He's in the place God told him to be. God said, if you're here, I will be with you. And then he lacks faith and doesn't trust that God will be with him and protect him in this situation. Verses 3 and 4 make very similar promises as God did to Abraham. Some ideas, same ideas, slightly different words. And then verses 6 through 9, which is kind of the main crux of the story, I just wrote, sins of the father, I guess. It's just such an interesting thing that they do the exact same thing. You'd think, I don't know if Abraham didn't share a lot of stories, I guess as a parent you don't normally share, like, let me tell you about time things went horribly because I was terrible, But yeah, so it's funny how they find out this time. So the King James has the phrase at the end of verse 8, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah. That's not a phrase we use anymore. So the Hebrew there can mean some sort of, he got caught because of PDA, public displays of affection, some sort of like caressing, hugging, embracing in a way that is just very clearly like, oh, that's not your sister, okay? So, yeah, and I put, he doesn't even have the same, like the lame, she's technically my sister thing to fall back on. She's his second cousin, but he's not even kind of right here. And like his father, he's rebuked by a Gentile king. It is interesting that actually, like, nothing happened all in all. So both of the times with Abraham, Sarah was taken to, like, the king's court, or however that worked out. In Egypt, there were plagues that started happening when this occurred of some kind. Rebekah doesn't even get taken at all. So, like, God actually was with them, even though Isaac didn't really believe that would be the case. So fortunately for everyone involved, nothing actually happened. So that's good. I'm curious what you think about verses 12 and 13. Then Isaac sowed in that land and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man waxed great, went forward, and grew until he became very great. What do you think of verses of blessing immediately following this sin of Isaac? Yeah, I think with this story, I think because we've already heard this story, I feel like Moses kind of made things a little more concise, but kind of dramatic and explicit. Like we said it's clearly a lack of faith because God told him what to do, told him to be with him. He didn't believe to an extent. And then in the Bible, I always think it's good to look for whiplash because it's on purpose. It's written down. So when you have a sin from Isaac, he's getting rebuked by a Gentile king, and then suddenly God is blessing him 100-fold. It's very easy, like with Abraham in these situations, he gets wealthy like immediately after, and you're going like, what's going on here? Like, so yeah, I think when you see whiplash like that, like it's intentional, and you're supposed to kind of be it's supposed to be jarring, I think. And you're like, okay, well, what does it say about God that he's blessing this guy who just did something pretty terrible? And you're kind of confronted with that idea of, oh, here's what it looks like when God decides to partner with and work through flawed human beings. And then, yeah, you can see his mercy, him keeping promises in spite of what the people choose to do with them. And then hopefully if that all makes its way back to you, you go, oh, thank God. It makes me uncomfortable when I see it in someone else, but I'm thankful God is good despite the things I do to mess it up. So Isaac is asked to leave the area because he's so bountiful that the king is concerned. And for the first time in a few weeks, you can take your workbook and open up to page 98. Since we're covering so much material this week, actually having just like the synopsis is pretty helpful. Should be about the middle of page 98. All right. There's a paragraph that starts with, God prospered Isaac in Gerar so greatly that the people kicked him out. He then had trouble with herdsmen from Gerar, disputing with him over wells. But God provided for Isaac. He went to Beersheba, where God appeared to him again, and told him to fear not. God again reassured Isaac, and he would multiply his descendants. Isaac responded by building an altar and calling on the name of the Lord. Abimelech then came back on the scene to renew a covenant with Isaac. The original covenant was between another Abimelech and Abraham. That's the rest of chapter 26. And I just thought, we have so much to cover. If you want to read it in your spare time, feel free. It's mostly talking about wells being filled in and redug, and it's just like a lot of back and forth, mostly about water. So that's the rest of chapter 26. And that is, again, that's Isaac's big story, like where he's the main guy, and it sort of just replays Abraham's story, and it's very interesting that that's what happens with him. Okay, so we're going to move on to Jacob and Esau. So we're actually going to back up to Genesis 25, because their birth story is not long. It's interesting, but it's not long. So we're going to go from their birth story into the main stuff you might know them from. All right, so if you're in Genesis 25, we're going to read verses 19 through 34. All right, verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Paddan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over, like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage from the field. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. Esau said unto Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore his name was called Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Maybe a story you've heard before. There's not a lot of stories about Jacob and Esau, so if you've heard one, 50-50 shot it's that one. Yeah, what do you think about that right off the bat? It's hard to say. If he's really on death's doorstep, then Jacob is beyond cruel. If he's not on death's doorstep, and it's like when we say that we're starving, then he is very emotional and hot-headed. And based on something that will happen later, I think he might be emotional and hot-headed, even if he has good reason. Yeah, so why don't we start with what is the birthright? Yeah, so let's flesh this out. Do we have a good definition of what a birthright is in this context? Okay, so a birthright in the ancient Near East, it is typically the blessing or the birthright for the eldest son. So what this tends to mean is, in the ancient Near East, a man has sons, and when he's going to die, let's say, okay, Jacob and Esau, you have two sons. You would take your estate, everything you have, your land, and you have two sons, you would divide it into thirds. And your eldest son would get a double portion, and the younger son would get, the leftover, the third in that case. But same thing, if you have 10 kids, you would divide it into 11 portions. The oldest would get double what everyone else is getting. And it usually came with land. That was a big part of it. So, yeah, one, that's an interesting concept. Can Esau sell his birthright? It seems clearly he did. You think, is it his to give away? Well, yeah, you can walk away from inheritance. You don't have to take things. Yeah, so that's what the birthright is, in essence. Yeah, it's not... Oh, 100%. Yeah. 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 Yeah, because he swore on it, so that's a big deal. He was gonna die. Yeah, it's yes, it is quite a bowl of soup. There have been many a sermon preached on such concepts. Yeah. Okay, anything else that jumps out at you? All right, so far from between now and the beginning of the Genesis study, have you noticed a theme of two brothers? This crops up quite a bit, and it rarely goes well. Okay, so obviously you start off with Cain and Abel. That's not great. The older one ends up being the villain of the story, if we can say that. Yeah, so it's crept up quite a few times, and like we said this back in Genesis 3, the idea of the curse and grief with basically family matters. And this kind of keeps just rolling on all the way up until the end of Genesis. You're going to see things playing out that way, brotherly strife, and it's just all through, especially Genesis. But yeah, from the text in verse 20, not a big deal. You just have a little reminder of Uncle Laban, because he'll be important later. Okay. Verse 21 was interesting. So Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So I think it's just because Isaac and Rebekah don't get nearly as much time spent on them in the text. So it doesn't seem like as big of a defining feature of Rebekah, but apparently, based on this verse, she's barren. Isaac prays, and the text moves quickly. You would kind of think this is in rapid succession. But we got two key points of data in this section: that Isaac was 40 when they got married, and he was 60 when she gave birth to Jacob and Esau. So she's barren for the first 20 years, apparently, and they have no children after them. So you think like, oh, great, Isaac prayed for his wife, and God worked this out, and it's, 20 years later, you're still dealing with a lot, kind of like the patience of Abraham in a similar way, this kind of stuff. Verse 23, you have the word of the Lord. Again, somehow. We have no explanation on how God communicated this to her. But 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. The one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And that verse is it's a key point in the story that puts it all into context. So you think, okay, so, what does this actually end up meaning? And we discussed what a birthright is as far as ancient Near Eastern custom goes, but what is a birthright in the context of the Abrahamic blessing? Okay, if the oldest son typically gets the land, well, what does this mean for the prophecy, the promises of God? Whoever ends up with this birthright, with the blessing, is the next in line of this Abrahamic covenant that will go from Abraham to Christ. So even though the wording may seem kind of vague there, the fact that the older of the children is going to serve the younger kind of starts leading you to think, oh, okay, something's happening with the blessing, the birthright, and the promise of God for the younger son, who is Jacob. Okay, so verses 25 and 26, the children are born. Do we know what the name Esau means? It means hairy. Their names were just very off the cuff. The kid is super hairy. We're going to name him Harry. Do we know what Jacob means? You have footnotes, don't you? Okay.
One who takes the heel.
Yeah, it's something like... Yeah, literally one who takes the heel. It's like heel grabber. It's a Semitic idiom of like a trickster, or maybe more malevolently, grabbing at someone's heel as they're walking by. It's not a compliment. Yeah, like a deceiver, tripping you up. They apparently had no baby names planned and just went with it on the spot. All right, so we see Esau end up being a great hunter. Verse 27, I believe, uses the word cunning, and that just means he's wise and knowledgeable. It's not a negative like it can be in our language. So Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. That is not as boring as it sounds. It's fine that he was plain. Job is actually described that way. That word can basically be quiet, mild-mannered, or civilized, which, as you compare it to the wolfman hunting in the forest, Esau, him being civilized in the tents, he kind of has just a different role.
Do you think Isaac knew that Jacob was supposed to be on this one?
Yeah, I don't know. You're dealing again with a situation like we dealt with Abraham and Sarah, where you're like, Sarah seems awfully surprised by the news that she's going to have a child. Did Abraham not tell her, or, how are we supposed to take this? Unfortunately, we don't get too much of a deep dive into Isaac and what he's thinking or feeling or what he knows or doesn't know. We just know how the story plays out. Okay, so Esau is a cunning hunter. Jacob is a mild-mannered tent dweller. Verses 29 through 31 is, that's where the plot thickens. That's the main stuff going on here. Jacob and Esau are both doing very Jacob and Esau things. Esau's been hunting. Jacob is making a bowl of red lentil soup. Likely some sort of stew. So it's funny, we said like how their names are just so straightforward of like what's going on in their life as they're born. Verse 29, verse 30. Esau said unto Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, the stew, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. Edom just means red. I don't know if this became a cruel nickname or what, but going forward, so, Esau will show up, throughout the book of Genesis for a time. And he's always called Esau. That's his name. Going forward, his descendants, where they end up settling, kind of out in the desert mountains, that nation that comes from him in centuries to come will be called Edom. So when you were asking like who are the two nations? So from Jacob and Esau, you're going to have the nation of Israel and the nation of Edom. So we don't think about Edom as much, but they do have a pretty significant role at different times in the Bible. Okay, so we talked about the birthright. And we sort of discussed this, but my question of it was like, should Jacob even have needed to do this? And I think the answer is obviously no. Like, God told Rebekah, hey, we're not doing the normal thing here. The firstborn is not who's going to be in charge of this situation. So he shouldn't have had to scheme and do these underhanded things, but he does. And this sort of I didn't take enough time to sit down and really divide it. I have a feeling that if I were to meditate on this text for like a half hour, the tree of life is probably in here somewhere, or the tree of good and evil. Because what he's doing is taking something good by wrong means. Way back when we discussed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we discussed how knowing good and evil, as it comes up throughout the scriptures, is positive. It's like a kid can't discern between good and evil, and when you grow up and you're wise and mature, you know how to discern between good and evil. But the point in the garden was they wanted to take it on their own terms. They wanted to find good and evil by disobeying God, not by following the word of God. Like Solomon says, I'm too young, I can't rule, I need to be able to discern good and evil, or good and bad, the Tov and Ra. And the same kind of thing's happening here, because the birthright should be Jacob's. Like, that seems to be what God wants to happen. And then he goes and takes it in this deceitful, underhanded, shady way. Well, and this is why I think the tree is in there somewhere, because This is also exactly what Abraham did with Hagar. God said he's going to give me an heir. Oh, cool, we have this Egyptian slave. Let's make this work. And God says, like, no, he's trying to do the thing that God said, but then does it in his own way, aside from the word and blessing of God. So, yeah, it's definitely, it's a repeated idea, at the very least. And then, yeah, he does throw in some bread. I think the bread was free, as it should be. And Esau leaves, and the statement at the end of the chapter is interesting. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And I think the idea with, like, he despised it, that sounds like a very strong phrase, but he didn't esteem it as he should have. I heard someone, like a commentator, mention it like profaning it, like taking something that should be holy and treating it as common. That's the idea of the holy versus the profane, like just a common thing versus the holy thing and how you treat it. So he didn't treat his birthright he didn't value it the way he should have. Which, based on that, makes me think he probably wasn't actually on death's doorstep. Otherwise, it would say, like, hey, fair trade, birthright for your life, okay, But yeah, based on that. Okay, so we have like 6 minutes to go. However, the last part of the lesson requires reading all of chapter 27, which is like 40-some verses long, and then discussing it. So, unless we're all staying till about 8:30, I don't think that's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, that's what he seems to do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the trouble with, not the trouble, the thing with something like the Garden of Eden is you watch this, like, okay, if that's the first thing, probably the first thing you read if you're just reading the Bible cover to cover, you read this story, and there's probably a lot of elements that make you scratch your head. And then, like, as we've studied, if you look closely, you see it, the same scenario cropping up later, like we talked about with Abraham and Hagar. There's a deceiving voice that has Abraham take of what he shouldn't, uses even like the same keywords from the garden, and you go like, oh, the tree's here again. And then this kind of like, next time you go to read the story of the tree, you can't not see some of the other elements. And then even if you're like, oh, well, where'd this snake come from? Well, like, that's not clearly identified until Revelation. So like the whole Bible tends to work as this just big, massive, cohesive, but like you get things scattered all over the place. So when you see, I think when you see how, if you took just Genesis 3 right on its own, then you go like, oh yeah, no, they weren't promised knowledge of good and evil. Did we even want good and evil? Like, is that right? And then you, especially in the Hebrew, you watch how that phrase gets used, you watch how this plays out, you watch how the story kind of repeats itself in the life events of these other people, and they're all people who, yeah, something's promised, and then they take it by their own deceptive means, and you kind of end up reading some of that back into the story, because the Genesis story is like the thing that, it's like just the story of sin that ends up on repeat throughout the Bible, so it's complex, but yeah, it's a big thing. Yeah, and when we get to the story, when we get to chapter 27 next week, especially because in chapter 27 you see Jacob, Esau, Rebekah, and Isaac, and there are really no like redeeming people there. I mean, not to be, not in the technical sense of the word, but like just from who am I supposed to like in this chapter? It's like no one. Like, yeah, there's plenty of blame to pass around in this little family. All right, well, It's a little clunky way to end since I was kind of like 5 minutes short on things, or I guess I was like half an hour too long on other things. So we'll finish Jacob and Esau, at least in this primary context, next week. They'll show up again after next week, especially Jacob's throughout the whole rest of the book. But yeah, so we'll have to do that next week and see where we get. I might just have to, I don't know, I don't want to cut stuff, but maybe shorten, recap some stuff. Maybe the book will come in handy for some of that. But anyway, that was a little bit of Jacob and Esau. Why don't we close in prayer? Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the truths contained in it. I pray you would help us to just consider these things, to consider the messages in your word, and maybe some of the things that we didn't even hit on tonight, some important aspects of your unfolding of this promise throughout history. Just pray you would lead us and guide us in the study of your word and as we consider it throughout the week. And God, I just pray you'd bring us back safely. And we thank you for this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.